Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure everybody can hear me.
Yes. Hear you.
Thank you for joining our April webinar. It'll be presented by Jeff Eaton from Lullabot, and the title of his talk will be "This is not a place of honor, content modeling." So before we start, I want to talk about Drupal GovCon organization and what we do. We're an open source community, and we tinker in all things open source. We, and in addition to this webinar that happens on the third Thursday, well, this one is happening on the 4th. But we also have Drupal GovCon conference that's held at NIH, July 29th through the 31st, and I'll provide a little more information about that later. We also do the Gov Summit at, now it's called Global Drupal Con due to the COVID-19, and we will continue to do that, and that will be in July 14th through the 17th. And lastly, we also do and participate in the Global Training Days. So there are a number of ways to reach us. We have an email address, Drupal4Gov @gmail.com. There are a number of Slack groups, Gov Drupal, and there's also a Slack group within Drupal, the channel Gov. You can reach us on Twitter and as well as Facebook. Sadly, I'd like to announce the passing of a friend and a Drupal4Gov organizer, James King. He's the reason why we hold the conference, Drupal Gov Conference, at NIH on a yearly basis. You probably saw him running around, assisting with lunches, helping with the keynote speakers. He just was an awesome individual, and he will definitely be missed. And we've also created the James King Memorial Scholarship. Each year, Drupal GovCon, we sponsored people to attend Drupal GovCon. And so since he was such a champion of this scholarship, we would like to name the memorial after him. And lastly, Drupal GovCon. So we are taking our guidance from the governor, Larry Hogan. And so we haven't changed our dates. It's July 29th through the 31st. And so we will communicate as soon as we know things. However, please register online. Registration is now open for Drupal GovCon. You also have the ability to submit your session. So, and if your company wants to sponsor, you can do that as well. And you can do that at drupalgovcon.org. So now I'm going to hand it off to Jeff Eaton. Thank you for being our April presenter.
My pleasure. It's great to be here, and hopefully it'll be a valuable experience for everybody. Let me just pop open my screen, and can everybody see my presentation okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I should clarify that I wasn't asking literally everyone to to weigh in, but
one more thing.
Yes.
I always forget to tell people that leave your comments in the chat, and toward the end of his talk, we will address all comments and questions.
Yep. So hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the amazing Drupal GovCon folks for organizing these events. And the title for this talk, "Not a Place of Honor," it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. If anyone has worked with nuclear waste disposal, that catchphrase may ring a few bells. We'll get to the background explanation for it later. But the idea started after a couple of public conversations with the Drupal GovCon team, or the Drupal4Gov team, about lessons learned not from amazing, cool projects that everyone likes to, go out and brag about, but the terrible stuff we've encountered, the projects that we've, come onto and tried to dig through and make sense of, and what lessons we can learn about content modeling from those projects in particular. And I think that it's an interesting angle to come at it from, and hopefully everybody will get at least some chuckles and some useful lessons out of it. Some background, my name is Jeff Eaton. You may see me weighing in on content strategy related stuff on Twitter if you hang out there. I work for a company called Lullabot. We do a lot of large scale Drupal builds, and we love content management and content related stuff. A lot of the clients that we work with, content is central to like either their business or their mission. It's a core part of what they do, not just part of their like side marketing efforts or something like that. And the interesting thing is that it's very easy to approach lots of content management projects and web publishing projects as making something new. But 99% of the time, we start with an existing website or multiple websites that have years and sometimes decades of history baked in. A lot of my work boils down to content modeling and the work that surrounds it, basically figuring out what different types of content there are, what the properties that define, those content types are, what makes an event different than a service or something like that. And then figuring out what the interrelationships between those different types of content are. That's sort of like at a high level, the meat of content modeling. And those things ripple out into, in a Drupal site, what node types get built out in a design, what different pieces of information do the designers have to work with when laying out, a page or stuff like that. So I sort of think of it as like the starting point for a lot of web publishing, understanding that content model and what it means. But that also means that a lot of my job revolves around forensics, like digging through an existing legacy content model and figuring out what exactly is there, what happened, how is it currently structured, and what's the intention behind it? Why is the site the way it is right now? And I got to tell you, I have seen some very, very strange stuff over the years. And I think just to set the tone, I want to open with a couple of mysteries from the legacy content model case files. The first one, which I think will always be anchored in my mind, because it was one of the first real bafflers that I encountered back in the 90s when I was working for a nonprofit that sold digital downloads. At the time, it was really cool, future forward stuff. They produced events and they recorded lots of training materials for people in their particular, nonprofit space. And they were actually selling like digital downloads of that stuff, which was great. It was cool. But when I was tasked with helping rebuild the CMS and the website, I discovered some really confusing data. It turns out that music that you could download or audio recordings had titles, descriptions, event dates, which confused me a little bit, registration costs, and finally, most baffling, every single MP3 was flagged with "is vegan," true or false. And I started looking through and even PDFs, scripts for, plays and little skits that went in between segments of, of an event, all flagged with whether or not they were vegan. And what became clear is that they also sold tickets to those live versions of those events. And most of the tickets were for all-day events that needed lunch handling, which meant that everything on the website needed to be able to be marked as vegan or not, regardless of whether or not it was actually a live ticket or not, because everything had been jammed into a single content type. So MP3s were vegan, PDFs were vegan, the whole deal. Eventually, we ended up teasing things apart, but for quite some time, we were trying to figure out why you could, in fact, create vegan MP3s. I still amuse myself trying to figure out what an extremely meaty PDF would be, but was never solved. Another one that I came across more recently was the case of the 50 article types. In Drupal, when you create a new content type, it gives you a lot of features for free. You get like the ability to create custom HTML templates to control the layout of the page. You can add custom fields, like an article has a byline in addition to just the body text and stuff like that. And you can also control access permissions. Things like specific kinds of users can create events, but other kinds of users can create articles. What we found was that this particular client had created 50 identical content types, all named article. And sorting that out led to some head scratching. They'd made one article content type for every single state in which they did business. And then they had also created a new user role for every single state, so that whenever they created a new account for someone who joined the company, they could say, oh, you have the Illinois role. And that would give them permission to create Illinois articles. And if they had the New York role, they could create New York articles. They had basically used a giant list of content types and a giant list of permissions to ensure that regional employees could only make content for their particular regional section of the website. And it worked okay for a little while. But the problem is Drupal has a permission screen. Well, I mean, other than just the technical implications of having 50 duplicate content types unnecessarily, Drupal has a permission screen where an administrator can go in and check off, what different user roles have access to what different types of content to create or edit or delete. There are 5 different permissions that you can check off for every content type and for every role. But what that meant was that this grid of content types and user roles created 12,500 different possible permissions to be checked off. And that was more than enough to crash Firefox just from the raw number of checkboxes on screen whenever an administrator would go in to control it. So they definitely hit the point where they needed to come up with a different solution. And the good news is there's lots of ways to actually do that cleanly in Drupal, but they had definitely hit the wall when they could no longer control permissions without Firefox crashing. Another one of my favorites, the case of the team mailing list. We were working with a client that sent out a weekly update email from the CEO to all of the different employees that the company had across the country. And they had 2 problems that they said were really causing them some pain with that. One was that adding new employees was so slow that only like administrators could do it. Sometimes they had to like go do database stuff themselves. It was, and there was also one really weird clue. They said that whenever they added a new announcement or a new, CEO update went out, it worked, but everyone who received it got like raw HTML markup in their email instead of, a nicely formatted message. And on closer examination, we discovered that the mailing list was actually a single blog post, not even multiple blog posts, but a single one that they would go back and edit each time there was a new message. And every single employee had been added as an editor for that one single blog post. And they had checked a checkbox that said notify editors of changes. And there were more than 6,000 employees. Each one had been added as an editor to this page. And fortunately, none of them realized they could actually go and post updates to the CEO's blog. But what this meant was that every single employee got a list of changes that had been made to this page to review and approve, which technically constituted an email list, but probably wasn't what they were going for. Untangling that ended up taking a little more time than we had anticipated, and we had to actually build out a content type for news updates that was tied into a mailing system. It got sorted out, but it was definitely a head scratcher when we were trying to figure out what was going on. The final one of these was the case of the 5-minute edit form. A client that we were working with asked for advice because their installation of Drupal was extremely slow. How slow, you ask? Well, every time they would click save after editing a page, it would take about 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes to actually save the page. And they said the problem actually traced its way back to when their team had rolled out a really amazing like visual design system that they had built out. They had page regions and components to go into those page regions and collections of components that had other components inside of them. And they had individual design components for buttons and for cards. And they had built out a content type for each one of those different design components. And then, you know, if you were making a page, it contained pointers to all of the things inside of it, and all of those things had pointers to all of it. And by the time they were done, every single page on the website was actually a collection of about 500 to 1,500 in some of the most egregious cases, 1,500 individual pieces of content made up every page. And they added a module because, you know, obviously editing a page like that is difficult. They'd added a module to Drupal that let them edit all of the pieces of content on a single page on one screen. So they could just hit edit and it would load every single one of those pieces of content. They could make their changes and hit save. And then it would walk through and update every single one of those 1,500 pieces of content. That was definitely one for the record books in terms of how difficult it was to untangle it. And it all traced back to, you know, perfectly reasonable decisions about wanting to make sure that their design system was reflected in how Drupal built pages. But it definitely went in a direction they weren't hoping. One of the questions that occurs after a long like day of sorting through old content and figuring out how to make sense of it is why does evil exist? It's, you know, why do bad content models happen to good organizations, and what do we do to deal with this? I've got a couple of theories. One is that malicious coworkers are trying to drive us mad in order to win a contest of some kind, perhaps a reality show. You know, you can check for cameras or something like that. This is not as common, but it has to be considered. Another possibility is that the world we inhabit is actually a test suite for another universe that works really, really well. That's one that I've been toying around with lately. But as much fun as it is to speculate on how we arrive at this point, the answer that seems to be the case most of the time is that all of us are doing our best under pressure with imperfect knowledge to build stuff that has to eventually launch and ship. And coming back to that has helped me engage with some of these head-scratching problems and recognize the problems, but also keep in mind that it's not that we're smarter than the people who came before us in most cases. It's that we only see the end results of the process that they had to go through to get there. So going back to a couple of those cases, the vegan MP3s, when the nonprofit I was working with started, all they had was an events management system. And slowly they'd started trying to figure out how to do new and interesting stuff, like selling videos of their events and stuff like that. But they had tried to shoehorn them into an events management system. Eventually they migrated away from the events management system to a new web platform, but they had carried over all of the old stuff and hadn't necessarily re-architected all of their content to reflect new capabilities. So everything still reflected the fact that MP3s, PDFs, tickets to live concerts, stuff like that, all had to be shoved into the model of an event. And what I was witnessing was the ripple effects of that. In the case of the 50 content types and 50 user roles that blew up Drupal's permission screen, they were trying to get a prototype out the door very quickly, and they didn't have a full-time developer on hand. So they were using the tools that they had quick access to by just logging into Drupal and configuring settings without actually writing any custom code or trying to evaluate any like third-party plugin modules. And although it ended up growing into something that was painful and they had to deal with, it made sense at the time, and they were working with the best tools they had available. The mailing list, at the time, it had started out as a CEO blog, and they just said, we need a mailing list. And when the company was tiny, it had worked fine. And it was only as they grew that it became clear what a problem it was. And the whole 1,500 pieces of content for a single page, that actually worked really well when when they were working on the 10-page prototype. It was a solution that worked at a small scale, but crushed the site as it grew. And that was, it was one of those things where the decisions they made early worked fine, and only later did unintended consequences come due. The biggest danger isn't that these kinds of content modeling choices get made, that, you know, the wrong way of breaking down the content of a page is chosen and some platonic ideal is violated. The biggest danger is actually that they were good enough for a while, and it's really hard to tell the difference between a necessary compromise due to the constraints that you're working with and what's just legacy cruft that should be discarded. The biggest danger is not being able to tell the difference between this works for now, we're going to keep it, and this is how it's supposed to be. This is a decision we made because we think it ought to be this way. That's a tangly and subtle distinction. And there's one more case that I want to touch on that I think sheds a little more light on this. It's the case of the giant pile of uranium. This comes back to the title of the talk. Depending on what different agency or, you know, branch of government or, you know, area you work in, you may be familiar with the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. It was a 25-year-long project running from about the mid to late 80s to I think about 2010, 2011. Basically, its goal was to figure out where to stick nuclear waste from power plants, like large quantities of it. And it had a couple of specific constraints, which I look back on whenever I want to comfort myself about like complicated requirements for a web project. They needed to be able to store lots of radioactive waste. It needed to last for about 10,000 years without breaking down and leaking radioactive waste everywhere. It needed to warn future humans for 10,000 years that they shouldn't break in to whatever facility or cave this was. And ideally, it couldn't look really cool. It couldn't be tempting as something that looked very, very valuable or whatever. And that ended up being the real problem. You know, it turns out the engineering task of where do you put a bunch of this stuff so it doesn't leak everywhere, you know, there are ways to do that. Most of them involve digging incredibly huge caves in, like, you know, salt deposits and stuff like that. But how do we warn people 10,000 years from now that the big thing we built is extremely dangerous, even though it doesn't necessarily look that way? Because if there's one thing that we've learned from Indiana Jones movies, it's that putting big scary warning signs on giant monuments doesn't convince people to stay away. It convinces them that there must be awesome treasure inside, and we will spend the next 30 years trying to get in it. So they had the technical aspects of it figured out, but they were trying to figure out how to convey a core message about this place, and they boiled it down to, you know, what they needed to translate into a bunch of different languages and pictographs and stuff like that. And the line that always struck me was, this place is not a place of honor. No highly esteemed deed is commemorated here. What is here is dangerous and repulsive to us. This message is a warning. And it sounds grim, but I'm also reminded of that text every time I'm sort of on a short deadline and trying to come up with some content, you know, some way of structuring content to fulfill an odd set of editorial requirements or design needs or something like that. I feel like even when I've made something that actually works, I feel like I want to be able to slap this sticker on it for future generations somehow, because how do we tell the difference between stuff that ought to be the way it is and stuff that is just the best we could manage? Like, how do we tell busted from the best we could do at the time? How do we tell the difference between those things? How we communicate that to future people working on projects is one question, but there's a couple of common patterns I've found when examining like past projects that I've inherited or content models that exist on an old site that is being, you know, rebuilt or something like that. Basically, what kinds of patterns indicate that the way things are structured are less than ideal? One of the most common ones is that the content model, like the kinds of content types that exist and how their different properties are broken down and what fields there are built around the structure of a visual page, not the content that is being written. Another one is that exceptions have sort of become the rule. Like one content type that was meant to just exist as, you know, a special case to handle oddball pages is, you know, 10 years later, all of the content is jammed into it. Lavaflow content models, cargo cult workflow. I'll dig a little bit more into each one of these in a second, but these four things, like content structure that models the visual appearance of a page, not content, exceptions becoming the rule, lava flows, and cargo cults. This modeling pages and not content thing is something that I think comes in waves. For a long time, a lot of Drupal sites in particular were heavily templated. And the idea was that, you know, you could pick a content type like an article or an event or something like that, and the Drupal site would handle everything about how that page looked based on what you entered in there. With the rise of sort of visual page building tools like Squarespace and stuff like that, there's a lot more emphasis on people being able to assemble pages themselves and just sort of click together, you know, a novel or interesting approach to, say, a landing page or a home page. And that can be really powerful, but it's also very easy to turn that into a content model that is just assembling visual bricks to, you know, to make something look a particular way. And that approach in particular tends to be very, very brittle when changes come, either in how the site is supposed to look or what system it's supposed to be built on. If the structures are all centered around how does a page look rather than what is the content we're making, it's brittle, and it usually merits attention when it comes time to restructure. That exceptions are the rule thing I mentioned a little bit. It's usually one of these signs is that, you know, every bit of content on the site lives in like a generic page content type, or every single page, you know, like 90% of the content lives in like a landing page builder or something like that. Stuff that was designed to give high flexibility, but not necessarily give you a lot of benefits of structure that a CMS normally can bring. when the structured content types don't really reflect how people are using the site and what kind of content they're publishing, things drift into those generic content types, and what's supposed to be the exception becomes the vast majority. Lavaflow content models, that's sort of like the archaeological layers of like an ancient city. The idea is that when you go back into time and you see like there's like historical waves of different types of content being created on a website and then being abandoned in favor of a new set of content types, and then maybe a year or so later they didn't get rid of those old content types, but they just added a new set and started making those. And it's I call it the lava flow pattern because it accumulates the way a volcano does. It's just new content types accrue on top of old ones, and the full content of the site is sort of a historical record rather than a unified whole.
Jeff,
yes.
I'm moderating the comments, and I see a lot of comments joking about the vegan PDF, but they also mentioned seeing it visually. Yeah.
See, like an example of the vegan PDF content model.
Yes, that was one of the questions.
You know, at the time, if I remember correctly, the way we discovered that was that all of the information was in the database and they were hiding information that wasn't appropriate depending on like what section of the site that it was in. It's been long enough that I don't have any examples, that I don't have screenshots of that, but I can see if I can dig up some details on that, on a couple of these models. Some of them, a few details have been changed to protect the innocent. I'm trying not to name names too much, but I've got some contact information, and if anybody's interested in following up for some background information on Twitter or via email, feel free to drop me a line.
Okay.
I think the bigger thing that's going on is that we are not seeing your slides advance.
Really?
It's been stuck on the title slide since you started.
Does anyone see?
No.
Yeah, it's just the first slide. It's kind of difficult to follow some of the parts you're explaining without any visual aid.
Ah, well, that definitely explains what you meant by seeing visual examples.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, because I am on slide, I think 17 right now.
Oh, okay, we were behind on the slide.
Okay, let's see.
Thank you.
Is it actually showing any other?
Yeah, now we see modeling pages, not content.
Okay.
Right, but it hasn't changed since then. We're only seeing modeling pages, not content.
Okay.
Now we see your slide deck. I see the slide deck. Modeling pages, not content.
Okay. For some reason, Zoom appears to be trying to pause sharing my screen every time I open Keynote. So what I'm going to do here is, I'm assuming you can see my screen now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I apologize. This is going to be a little bit goofy, but I'm going to. Okay. So I'm just going to keep this open like so, rather than actually going through and advancing through the presentation. I apologize for the hitches up to this point. I will share a PDF. I will share a PDF version of these slides to go with it. So let's see. Okay, so we were talking about these 4 different patterns we were looking at. Modeling pages, not content, exceptions of the rule, Lavaflow content models, and cargo cult workflow. The Lavaflow content model, basically when different historical waves of content types are created and then abandoned. that's usually a sign that needs have changed, but no revisiting of the older content occurred and just new stuff was built on top of it. And the final one, cargo cult workflow, it's when no one actually knows why content is made in a certain way, but it's just how everything gets done and how things must be done or everything breaks. Like no one knows why you have to create these 3 things in this particular order, but it breaks down. Or no one knows why you have to put a snippet of JavaScript in the zip code field, but it's just what needs to happen. Those are usually signs that what is needed has changed radically over time, and what's the structures haven't necessarily kept pace with it. The process of actually, just like I'm actually going to pop open the chat and see if I can keep it open in the side on another screen so that I'm not surprised by any other technical hiccups. Okay. I think of it as a sort of like going on the forensic model of like how to approach these different, how to approach discovering the history of these content models. It's an approach I kind of refer to as forensic empathy. It's digging through to find out what happened and why and how, but the goal is to maintain empathy and understanding for the folks that were under the constraints that produced this stuff. I like to think of like, this is definitely a slide where I'm glad you can actually see the pyramid here rather than me just describing it. Every project is at its base has goals and aspirations, like things that an organization wants to change or wants to do better, or things that individuals would like to accomplish as they build. They want to make something that is high quality, or they want to make sure that their bosses are happy with the result, all kinds of possibilities like that. But those goals and aspirations meet constraints, things that keep them from just doing the most amazing job they can imagine. And then on top of those constraints, choices get made. Basically, goals and aspirations plus the constraints that people are under result in choices about what they're going to prioritize, what they're going to, how they're going to tackle the problems that are in front of them. And what we see when we pick up an old website is the result at the very top. It's the final artifact of a working website that all of those choices produced. And the challenge is that oftentimes the choices are never clearly, are very rarely clearly articulated, only the single final thing that resulted from those choices. And behind those choices, the constraints that they were working with and the underlying goals that shaped, the directions that they were going, stuff like that, are very rarely articulated, and they're often lost in the mists of time. So along with actually deconstructing the content itself, one of the keys is to hunt for the original intent of what was created as much as possible. Is there any documentation that that is rarer than one would wish for, but one must always ask. Oftentimes, especially in organizations where there's a lot of institutional consistency, or there are old timers around that you can like bring on board and ask, figuring out, can I talk to people who worked on the previous version of this project or 2 versions ago or something like that? What do they recall about why particular things are the way they are? What shaped that? What were the goals? And also keeping in mind the intent for change. Like if a project is being updated or renovated or redesigned or something like that, what are they hoping will change? So that's the original intent, both in the past and in the future, making sure that both of those are understood. The examining those past constraints is important to understand, like what choices got made alongside those goals. Like it could be limited budget, and that, in my mind, that covers both financial budget and time budget. They may have had plenty of money to work with on a particular project, but it absolutely positively had to get out the door within 90 days or something like that. Team knowledge and experience is also a kind of constraint. There may be incomplete knowledge or time to do lots of research on what's needed. So they work with their best guesses on what kind of solutions will be the best fit for the needs. Or there may be people with limited experience in a particular area picking up a new tool and doing their best with it. Those kinds of things are constraints just as much as a budget or anything like that. Working with technology that we now consider outdated is also a big factor, or even just technology that isn't even necessarily outdated but might not have been a perfect fit. That idea of the event system, the event management system that grew into a content management system is a great example. The choices that were made because of that particular technology that they were working with carried through into subsequent systems, even though they were capable of more. So understanding that the way it was resulted from past constraints that are no longer in effect gave a good idea of where we could go in the future. And political pressures are also a kind of constraint. There's some things that are technically the right way to approach something, but because it requires buy-in from a number of different teams or departments that may have differing interests or needs, those are legitimate constraints on what can and was built. And then finally, like in terms of once those things have been sussed out, or at least you have a little bit of picture of them, figuring out what of those goals and constraints are still the same and what ones have changed is important, because technology matures, political pressures change. Sometimes it's a department's priorities change, or a state agency gets new leadership that that wants to collaborate more effectively with another agency or something like that. In other situations, just our understanding of particular kinds of technical problems advances, and we know of better ways to tackle certain problems. So figuring out, in what situations are the constraints that we're under still the same as always and what's changed, that can help figure out where we can concentrate on improving things. Basically, the rule of thumb here is the more we understand about why something is the way it is, the easier it is to improve how it works and like what it is that's been built there. And the other one is whenever possible, if you're learning these things and figuring them out, documenting those goals and constraints and the choices you're making based on those things, documenting those for the next generation of people that come and pick up your stuff is also super important. And Murphy's Law also means that inevitably someday you may be the person coming back to your old project and trying to recall all of those trade-offs and choices you've made. And recording this stuff for yourself is actually pretty helpful. I think that's it. I feel really bad because some of the earlier slides that got skipped had really fun clip art, including a picture of the proposed Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. But it's really just a giant... Oh,
I
bring
say
it up?
show them, yes, absolutely. Since we missed it, I know we want to see them.
Okay, so this is a proposed design for the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. It was indeed a mountain with an incredibly huge hole dug into it. And the problem is that every way that they could figure out how to put giant signage that would endure the passage of time also screamed, there must be really cool stuff inside of this mountain to any prospective treasure hunters, 10,000 years from now. It's the Indiana Jones problem is significant. I think that's it. This was also my rough image of what forensic examination of legacy content models is like. There's actually very little blood involved in content modeling most of the time. But with that aside, I want to say thank you. We've got a little time. I can dive in and take some questions if anyone has them. But if you want to dig in a little more, you can go to twitter.com/Eaton and heckle me. You can drop me a line at Eaton at Lullabot. And I've got a lot of articles and other writing on content modeling and content strategy, especially inside of the context of Drupal, up on the lullabot.com website. And with that in mind, are there any questions? I'm trying to jump into the chat and scroll back and see if there's anything that jumps out.
Yeah, I think someone said, please explain what you mean about the lava lamp.
Oh, yes, let's see, the Lavaflow content model. So the idea there is that this is actually a term that comes from software development. So when software grows like lava, it means that old stuff is never fixed or changed or or reworked. New stuff just flows out on top of it and hardens like lava accumulating on a volcano. And we've seen this pattern in content models for large organizations where, say there's a batch of 10 content types that get defined for a site when it launches. And then a year later, they make 5 or 10 new content types on top of that and just stop using the old ones. And then by 4 years later, you've got, 40 or 50 different content types, but only maybe, 5 or 6 are actually being used. And it's almost like the archaeological layers of like an ancient city where you can say, this is the call to action content type that was used from 2014 to 2015. So, like that sort of accumulation generally means that as needs change and evolve, old stuff isn't necessarily getting reworked to accommodate that. It's just left in place and you get a lava flow. And one of the reasons that's tricky is because it can mean that there's no clear indication for a newcomer or somebody who's picking up the system and trying to work with it. What's the old out of date stuff and what's the new stuff and what should be used versus what will break if you touch it and stuff like that.
Okay, thank you. So we do have another question by Ralph. One thing that still puzzles me, how to deal best with the glue in between content types, meaning singular content not corresponding to an entity and not warranting its own content type. So site owners are still able to edit those parts alongside content types as well? Question mark. Is it accomplished best with blocks and view modes?
Is it accomplished? Yeah, that is a big question. I will try to give a very quick answer, but that's something I've been chewing on and writing about for probably about 5 years. So yes. So the question is basically when you're dealing with a complicated page or system of pages on a website where there's lots of different pieces of content type that make things up, but you don't necessarily want to make a given standalone piece of content out of each one, but you've got content components you need to assemble. How, what are the best tools to handle that with? There's a lot of different ways to do it. There's tools like paragraphs in Drupal are very popular specifically for that kind of stuff. Oftentimes though, just making a dedicated content type for those sub-page components, but using a module like Rabbit Hole, check it out on Drupal.org. It basically lets you go in and say, there's certain content types that should never appear on their own page, just hide them and let me use them, when I'm editing and creating stuff to compose other pages out of them, but never actually let them show up in search on their own or something like that. That's one of the things that we do. The layout tools in Drupal 8, the layout builder and stuff like that, lean heavily on blocks, and that's another way to approach that. I would say that which one of those to use in a specific circumstance really depends a lot on like the specifics of, you know, how much you want to reuse, whether things need to appear in multiple places, how, you know, do you need permissions to control stuff? There's a lot of other factors in there. I will stop talking now and we can take that one to Twitter.
You have more questions. So from Carl, hi Carl. So what do you recommend for involving low-touch stakeholders?
So, so how to get low-touch stakeholders involved? I've known a lot of people, especially on design teams, who, you know, in particular seem to suffer a lot from, you know, working through lots of iterations of things and, you know, presenting them to people and getting sort of a yeah, okay, that's good. Or, you know, some stakeholders will just not actually weigh in until the very last moment when tons of work has already been done and say, actually, I think, you know, everything needs to be blue instead. It's low touch stakeholders are actually feel a little less dangerous than low touch until the very last minute stakeholders. But I think the best we can do is be very explicit about like when there are cutoff points where, you know, we haven't heard back from you with feedback on X or Y or Z yet, but subsequent work that we do depends on us making a choice about this. So, you know, we need to get a, you know, a thumbs up or a thumbs down by Wednesday on this specific decision so that we can proceed forward. Even if it's not, you know, even if somebody hasn't been highly engaged, at least making it clear that we have to move forward with a decision on X. So, you know, speak now or forever hold your peace, and we'll try to, you know, do our best. That's the best way I've figured out how to do it. But it's one of those political constraints, I think, you know, how to navigate that with different individuals.
Quick question on that. Thanks a lot. One thing I've noticed when I'm doing like UX and UI design, it's going out here and actually using whiteboarding to involve stakeholders, since it seems to break the barrier, and they seem to, it's sort of like it breaks some sort of a plane that they can get involved with and even start marking things up. Have you ever used that? If you have, would you recommend it?
I live and breathe whiteboards and sketches, and my colleague Greg Dunlap can testify to that. I even have a portable, like, notebook sized whiteboard and a little whiteboard marker that I can use with it specifically for that kind of stuff. I would definitely agree. You know, ideally, when getting that kind of feedback from stakeholders, figuring out like what form the information needs to get to them in, such that they can, you know, figure out what it is that you're really asking them and what they're supposed to make a decision on, is really helpful, because oftentimes we're used to working in like particular forms of information that are specific to our disciplines. Like for a developer, it may be a feature list, or for a UX person, it may be a wireframe. For a designer, it could be, you know, more high fidelity stuff that, you know, may not be as structurally precise, but captures, you know, things like more aesthetic aspects of the site. And oftentimes the decisions that are being made may not necessarily be automatically in the form that a given stakeholder finds easiest to absorb and sort of weigh in on. And whiteboarding and like more real-time conversations at those times when a decision has to be made, I think can really help ensure that like what needs to be understood is getting through and they feel informed enough to weigh in. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I think this may be our final question from a T. Andrew Miller. So is there a chance of modeling content like a DBA would normalize and model databases to first normal form, etc.? Could that model principle work?
That's a question from my own heart. There's actually a whole like a whole discipline around how to structure the underlying database tables in which individual bits of information get stored in, in a content management system, or, lots of different, types of software. And there are tons and tons of similarities in the decisions that a database administrator makes when figuring out how to plan the underlying tables that data gets stored in. There's tons of similarities to how structured content gets designed, to how we figure out what deserves its own content type, or what should be, what things should be consolidated into one content type with a flag to determine what section it's in, versus two content types that, are specialized for those things. Those are very similar to the kinds of decisions that DBAs make when planning out database table structures. There are some differences, and I think assuming that there would be a one-to-one correlation between content that writers and editors and the members of an organization who are supposed to update the website, they're not necessarily going to be approaching their authoring and management tasks with the same mental models that the data storage needs to live at. So there's some negotiation that goes there, but I think the general principles of like database modeling are very, very compatible with content modeling. And, you will probably not regret, like, if you want to dig deeper into that, picking up a beginner's guide to like database modeling and the different normal forms, which I am sure that this is a terrible time to start talking about like the third normal form or whatever, but it's out there on Wikipedia, and it can be a really helpful set of established principles from one discipline that you can use to help inform your work in the content modeling discipline.
Okay, so Andrew Miller, he followed up with another comment. He says, taxonomy is everything. That is why I thought maybe DBA practices would work exactly. To this point, do you see many enterprises that staff a data librarian taxonomy role?
In really, really large organizations where like how they organize their products or their information, or how they organize their communication around the different kind of businesses that they do, dedicated, taxonomists whose role is basically organizing and figuring out the categories that they are going to group all of their content and information into, those do exist. Oftentimes, in the vast majority of organizations, I find that someone wears that hat and is responsible for it, but it may not be their official job title. It may go under they're in charge of IA, or they own a section of the website, or that may be how people talk about it or something like that. But it is common that there's either a person or a handful of people that wear that hat, even if it isn't their official job title. At least that's what I've found.
Got it. Well, I believe that was our last question. So thank you again for presenting for our April webinar.
My pleasure. And I will also be posting a PDF of this for folks that want to catch some of the earlier slides that got lost. Thanks for your patience.
Okay. Thank you. And also, after the webinar, we'll be sending out a survey. So please make sure you fill that out. And everybody stay healthy, sane, and practice social distancing. Until the next time. Thank you.